Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ethan Katz. I teach in the Department of History, and I'm the faculty director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at Berkeley. And it is my tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon, David Sorkin. David is the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Modern Jewish History at Yale University. Before that, he taught at CUNY Graduate Center, Brown, Oxford, and my PhD alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I first encountered David. So he's a dear friend and a cherished mentor. He received his PhD in this department in history at UC Berkeley under the guidance of Marty J., who I was so happy to see just walked in. So some of you know David was my teacher, my doctoral co-advisor, my primary mentor in Jewish history. He's done an extraordinary amount to shape the way that I research, think, and write about the Jewish past and present. For my students here on whom I've inflicted many of my strong-held outlooks about how to learn and do Jewish studies, I learned most of them from David, but more on that a little bit later. For some 4 decades, David has been widely acknowledged as among the world's leading scholars on the history of Jewish politics, culture, and society in early modern and modern Europe, and on the history of religion in the Enlightenment in particular. He's the author, editor, co-editor of 10 books, many of them highly acclaimed, as well as of numerous influential peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. He's won a number of prestigious fellowships, including from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm just going to try to give you a little bit of an idea of the range and depth of his scholarship by pausing for a moment over 3 of his monographs. His first book was The Transformation of German Jewry, 1780 to 1840, published in 1987 by Oxford. It received the present tense Joel H. Cavier Literary Award for History. And this study led to a major reassessment of German Jews in the first half of the 19th century as it sought to dispel teleological arguments about both anti-Semitism and about the loss of Jewish identity. Instead, it showed the vibrancy of German Jews' inner lives and relations with larger German culture, arguing persuasively for the creation, however unwittingly, of a German Jewish subculture by the mid-19th century. David examined a range of figures here from Moses Mendelssohn to the German Jewish novelist Bertold Auerbach to the great father of neo-Orthodoxy, Samson Raphael Hirsch. After this book, David entered a phase of his career that centered on resituating Moses Mendelssohn and other figures of the religious Enlightenment. In the case of Mendelssohn, he did this in significant part by looking at the philosopher's considerable works in Hebrew, which had been almost entirely neglected in prior scholarship. His remarkable comparative study, The Religious Enlightenment, published by Princeton in 2008, was sort of the crowning achievement of this phase of his career. It went further than almost any prior book at the time in resituating the Enlightenment, long understood as a decidedly secular phenomenon in a far richer and ultimately, I would argue, more convincing historical context. The book examines 6 different thinkers in 6 different countries in great depth. It argues forcefully and persuasively for the deeply religious components of the Enlightenment and the deeply religious origins of much of modern thought. The third book I want to discuss briefly is his mammoth work, Jewish Emancipation, A History Across 5 Centuries, published by Princeton in 2018. This book was the product of more than 20 years of research and thinking on the topic of Jewish emancipation. It took an unprecedented approach to the topic that was at once global in scope and granular in detail and context. David argued that emancipation needed to be understood always as a process, entering and receding, and that began long before the first so-called emancipation decrees, with Jews enjoying similar kinds of rights in numerous localities in the early modern era. It also unfolded very differently in different regions, and perhaps most importantly, he argued that emancipation was the dominant central question of all of modern Jewish history. Even the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel, the central events of the Jewish 20th century, David argued provocatively, could only be understood as part of the larger struggle over the question of emancipation. It's safe to say that no one who writes about Jewish emancipation in the foreseeable future will do so without having David's book at their side and ubiquitously featured in their footnotes. Now, most recently, he has completed The Emancipationists, 19th Century Jews' Campaigns for Citizenship, due out from Yale in September, and he will be speaking about that book today. So David's work has ranged across a vast temporal and geographical scope over time. What I see as constant features of the work are a kind of exactitude and precision in an effort to make sense of things that prior scholarship has either ignored or cast too simplistically, and in many cases a debunking of myths about the origins or development of Jewish modernity or modernity more broadly. And concision. David does not waste words. When I first met David, the same could hardly be said of me. Truthfully, I found David by luck. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and David were brave enough to take a flyer on me when no other graduate school did and admit me to the PhD program. And David gave me a kind of rare training in Jewish history that I could have received in few other places, and that has given me the capacity to range widely across the field in ways I never could have imagined. David agreed to advise my dissertation, though it was well outside of his area of expertise. That, however, did not keep him from making forceful suggestions about the shape that it should take, and they were generally very good suggestions. He, first of all, told me that a dissertation that I originally imagined being about basically post-war Jews and Muslims in France, maybe even starting in the 1960s or 70s, that I should go all the way back to the early 20th century and the First World War. This seemed kind of fanciful to me at the time, but his instinct was absolutely right, and it did a great deal to shape the ultimate dissertation and book that came from that. The first meeting that I ever had to talk about chapters of my dissertation with David, I came into his office and he scratched his head and he looked at me and said, "Well, writing your dissertation is a learning process, Ethan." And he then proceeded to talk about how when he wrote his dissertation, he had a hard time writing long enough chapters, but that was not my problem. And that what I had given him was extraordinarily repetitious, and that I could never think that my committee would be willing to read my entire dissertation if I did not do more line editing before submitting any further parts of it. That was a rather difficult meeting for me, but it was probably the most important meeting I ever had with anyone to talk about my dissertation during the writing process. David has not stopped giving me much needed advice. Not long ago, I sent him a draft of the intro of my current book manuscript. He told me to go write a different book. I'm kidding, sort of. No, his advice was truly valuable, and it helped me to make crucial progress on the conceptualization and organization of the project. I've heard David described as a giant by one leading scholar and an absolute prince by another. But my favorite description of him came from a graduate student at Madison, who actually never got as far as their dissertation, who said to me once, "Don't you love David? He's a person." And I know it's quite the come down from giant or prince, right? But it says as much or more about David because his fundamental care and decency came through always as an advisor and a mentor to myself and so many other people. And it comes through as well in the stories he tells and how he tells them as a historian. So I've gone on too long. I've embarrassed my teacher and my friend enough. His talk this afternoon is entitled "Three Transitions in Modern Jewish Politics, 1744, 1878, 1919. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Ethan, for that. I think you've taken my lecture. For that extraordinary introduction. My special thanks for returning my lecture. It was a pleasure to teach Ethan. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to watch you develop over the years. Extraordinarily gratified by the kind of scholar you've become, and also playing an important role as an activist on campus. That's something for all of us as teachers and scholars to admire. Thank you again for that introduction. So let me thank Ethan and Duncan McCrae for inviting me, and Jennifer Lipscomb and Etta Haber for expertly making all the arrangements. It's a pleasure for me to return to Berkeley, to Dwinell Hall. I first came to Berkeley in 1975. I've never forgotten seeing my first palm tree, and received my PhD in 1983. I was extraordinarily lucky in my teachers, my dissertation advisor, Marty J., and other Berkeley faculty, including Martin Malia, Lynn Hunt, Richard Webster, Robert Alter, and such distinguished visitors as Hans Mommsen. It's my pleasure to address you on a topic close to my heart, and perhaps on your minds as well. In thinking about modern Jewish politics, I want to focus on Jews' agency, that is, their ability to create new forms of political activity. My contention is that the modern period is characterized by continuous political activity and the proliferation of new and enduring political practices. I want to propose two main arguments. First, that Jewish politics is a study in resilience. History teaches that nothing in politics is permanent. Stunning victories can be gradually subverted or swiftly overturned. Tragic defeats can similarly be reversed. Resilience is the unwavering commitment to innovate in new situations, the tenacity to improvise new methods and practices while remaining true to fundamental principles and core values. Second, I want to suggest a new chronology for modern Jewish politics. The conventional wisdom, or now standard textbook account, is that modern Jewish politics date from the early 1880s. That is, from the shock of the pogroms following the assassination of Alexander II in Russia, that discredited the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, and gave rise to Jewish nationalism and Jewish socialism. Thus, the first Zionist Congress and the first Congress of the Bund, the Jewish socialist movement, were both held at the end of the following decade in 1897. This chronology is neat, simple, and fundamentally erroneous. Its historical inaccuracy has had and continues to have misleading political consequences, for it invalidates and dismisses other forms of Jewish politics that have been significant and continue to be significant in shaping modern Jewish life. It is highly partisan, but has for so long been accorded the credence of incontrovertible truth that we have unlearned how partisan it in fact is. My argument this evening is that modern Jewish politics begins as early as the mid to late 18th century. I'll point to 1744. Jewish nationalism and socialism were latecomers that built on the foundations of what I call emancipationism, the central politics of the long 19th century. Today, I'll use the transition from one form of politics to another to survey the major political configurations in the long 19th century that are foundational for Jewish modernity. Among many forms of politics, my concern is with one aspect, what's come to be called intercession, or in Hebrew, shtadlanut, which has been a term in use since the 14th century. It was first used in 1354 in Barcelona. The Hebrew, it comes from the verb lehishtadel, to exert oneself, and means interceding with the highest power that there is, the sovereign. And this relationship is usually termed the royal or vertical alliance. The issues of intercession or the vertical alliance range from the extreme of negotiating terms of settlement, averting expulsion, to negotiating taxes, or the ability to observe Jewish law, the status of Jewish courts, the synagogue, the mikveh, the cemetery, the eruv, etc. So what I'd like to do is to address three historical moments of the long 19th century. What are these dates? 1744 marks the expulsion of Jews from Prague. It's an example of politics in corporate society and turns on an issue of privileges, corporate privileges, and especially the privilege of residence. The second date, 1878, is the Congress of Berlin, which is an example of politics in the age of liberalism. It's about individual rights or citizenship. And the third, 1919, is the Paris Peace Conference following the First World War. It's an example of politics of 20th century ideologies, and especially of national minority or collective rights. So let's begin with Prague in 1744 and the politics of corporate society. Prague was the largest urban Jewry on the continent in the 18th century. There were about 8,000 to 10,000 Jews in Prague. The setting here The setting here is the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748. Prussia contested Maria Theresa as a woman coming to the throne as an empress to the Habsburg throne. During the war, Prussia occupied Prague, and after returning to Prague, Maria Theresa expelled the Jews on a charge of colluding with the Prussian enemy. Now here's the question for us. How was it that the kings of England, Denmark, and Poland, the Estates General of Holland, the Pope, an archbishop, and a number of other bishops interceded with Maria Theresa, asking her to rescind the order of expulsion? The fact is, Jews interceded. At first, it was community intercessors from Prague and Vienna who interceded with Maria Theresa. They even brought her a huge salmon from the season's first catch. She appreciated the salmon, but not the Jews who brought it. Their intercession was a dismal failure, and she remained unmoved. She also didn't like the fact that they started to cry and wail, which was one of the standard practices of Jewish intercessors. There were three standard practices. One was to appeal to legal documents, charters and the like. The second was to cry and wail. And the third was to bribe. Those were the practices of intercession in the 17th and 18th century, particularly in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also in the Habsburg Empire. Now, in response to the community intercessors' failure, a network of court Jews stepped forward and assumed control. Now, who are the court Jews? This is a much abused term in Jewish history. You know, people talk about Henry Kissinger as a court Jew or Jared Kushner as a court Jew. But court Jews were actually a specific historical phenomenon belonging to a specific period. Court Jews were Jews who served sovereigns in reforming and rebuilding states after the devastation of the 30 Years' War, particularly from 1618 to 1648. Central Europe, what we now think of as Germany, Austria, etc., consisted of over 300 polities, secular polities, ecclesiastical, free cities, all kinds of different arrangements. And each of these polities, or many of these polities, had its court Jew. Wealthy Jews who served as purveyors of goods, brought in revenue and other kinds of loans, and also a form of expertise. Jews were often brought in to reform the mint of the polity and the way in which coins were minted and currency created, to reform the postal service, et cetera, et cetera. Now, court Jews used their networks to disseminate news and enlist support about the expulsion. They circulated capsules to control information, what to say to elicit support from powerful individuals, and what those individuals should say when contacting Maria Theresa. That is how the King of England, the Dutch Estates General, the Pope, and a number of bishops and cardinals intervened on the Jews' behalf. Here's an example of the careful handling of information. And this is one court Jew writing to another. I have received your letter dated January 5th, as well as the enclosed copies of your letters to the Bishop of Bamberg and to the conference minister in Vienna, including some information, as well as the letter written by you and our common relative, the rabbi, to the elders in Mantua, and in an identical manner to those of Venice, Turin, and Rome. I report that my father-in-law has informed his son about his and Rabbi Herzfeld's visit at the court of the abbot bishop last Sabbath evening. In the enclosed excerpt, you find that they have succeeded and that the bishop mentioned you, my father and teacher, etc. So here is intervention using controlled information. Here's what's happening. This is all you need to know. This is what you need to do, right? So these are people who have access and know how to use it. Now, Maria Theresa received all of these interventions. As an absolutist ruler, she was adamant and refused all entreaties. In fact, her own advisors told her she never should have issued that edict of expulsion, and now she should rescind it. She didn't care. Now, she finally relented when the Bohemian nobility refused to pay their taxes until the Jews were brought back to pay their share. So it was really an issue of domestic pressure rather than international protest. Okay, to sum up our first example. It's a transition. Oh, here's a portrait of one of the court Jews, Wolf Wertheimer. 1744 represented a transition from community intercessors to court Jews acting across Europe. The court Jews themselves, it's important to keep in mind, were a transitory phenomenon. They really belonged to the period from 1648 to 1815, because Napoleon redrew the map of Central Europe. During the Napoleonic period, he reduced the number of polities from 300 to 37. And after 1815, states began to raise funds not through personal loans from individuals, but rather through the new bond market. And those court Jews who maintained their fortunes became private bankers who funded states by floating loans on the new bond market and, of course, charging a percentage. And of course, the best known former court Jews who became private bankers were the Rothschilds. Okay. Second example, 1878, the Congress of Berlin, or politics in the age of liberalism. Here's the question. How was it that a major international Congress guaranteed Jews equal rights and citizenship in the new Balkan states emerging from the Ottoman Empire, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, etc. At the Congress of Berlin, the great powers, England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and Italy, convened to deliberate over the conditions for granting independence to the new states. One prerequisite is that the great powers wanted equality for all Christians. They were worried that Catholics and Protestants would suffer in these new Eastern Orthodox states. The question then was, would Jews also have equal rights and citizenship? The Congress of Berlin represented a major diplomatic victory for the new Jewish leaders I call emancipationists, those who advocated for Jewish equality. The Congress required Romania and the other states to extend citizenship to Jews in order to gain the great powers' recognition as independent states. This effort was the culmination of 6 or 7 decades of intensive development of emancipation politics by a new generation of leaders who worked to gain citizenship and equal rights across Europe and in the United States. And here it's important, I think, to differentiate these leaders I call the emancipationists from the leaders that historians have conventionally concentrated on, the so-called enlighteners or maskilim, the leaders of the Haskalah. And I think the fundamental differentiating characteristic between the two groups is that the maskilim, the leaders of the Jewish Enlightenment or Haskalah, were by and large autodidacts in secular studies. They had yeshiva training in Jewish texts, but their secular training was by and large their own. The new leaders, the emancipationists, in contrast, had formal schooling in secular subjects. And we have to think our ways back, think back historically to understand the significance of the fact that they attended secular schools and then secular universities, because it means they learned their secular culture from Christian teachers and alongside Christian students, which is a totally different experience than being an autodidact in secular studies. It means you're talking to people, to other people, and not just to books. Okay, so who were the emancipationists? They were lawyers, university-trained lawyers, who wrote tracts and used the courts to bring lawsuits. There were the editors who founded new vernacular language newspapers. The first vernacular language newspaper was the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, founded in 1837, followed very quickly by vernacular language newspapers in French, 1840, English, 1841, and in Russian, beginning in the 1860s during the great reforms of Alexander II. Those newspapers disseminated news about emancipation. They kept their readers informed of the progress of emancipation around the world. They organized public meetings. They wrote and circulated petitions, and they raised funds in order to support those efforts. In addition, there were leaders. This is a map of emancipation. In addition, there were leaders of philanthropic organizations, and a decade or two later, new civil defense organizations. Now, here's one example of the kind of historical inaccuracy that we've lived with for many decades or a number of generations. The actual first civil defense organization was founded in the United States. If you look at textbooks of American Jewish history, the Board of Delegates of American Israelites, founded in 1859, will barely get a mention, maybe half a sentence, a subordinate clause, always a subordinate clause, maybe a footnote. And that's because those who write American Jewish history still hold to the myth that American Jews did not have a process of emancipation, that they had equal citizenship from the moment that the Constitution was passed. And that ignores the fact that American Jews in the 19th century had to struggle to gain political rights at the state level. Jews weren't allowed to vote in New Hampshire until 1877. Right? There was a major struggle in the state of Maryland in the 1820s. And following I won't go on and on with it. So the textbook version is that the first civil defense organization was the Alliance Israélite Universelle, founded in 1860 in Paris. But in fact, it was the Board of Delegates of American Israelites, founded in 1859, followed by an Austrian version, the Österreichische Israelitische Union, founded in 1882, the Zentralverein Deutschen Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, founded in 1893, the American Jewish Committee in 1906, and the Anti-Defamation League in 1913. So these emancipationists were instrumental in Jews gaining rights across Europe and in the United States. You can see this on the map, this is the map of East Central Europe. Jews gained equal rights in England in 1858, in Italy in 1861, in Austria-Hungary in 1867, Germany 1870, and political rights in the US and various states beginning in the 19th century. Here, is there a, nope, sorry. Okay, so what's the Congress of Berlin about? And this is a map in Hungarian, but it's an excellent map of the new states emerging in southeastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, later Bosnia, et cetera, et cetera. Having secured rights in their own countries, the emancipationists endeavored to secure citizenship for their less fortunate co-religionists in other countries. Leaders such as the banker Garrison Bleich. Oh, okay, here's a map. My slides are a little bit out of order. Here's a map showing when Jews gained emancipation across Europe with dates. Leaders such as the banker, okay, and here's, sorry, Board of Delegates of American Israelites. It did exist, even though it doesn't feature in most of the textbooks or even more detailed accounts of American Jewish politics. Leaders such as the banker Garrison Bleichroeder, 1822 to 1893, attended the Congress and orchestrated the lobbying of delegates, often on a daily basis. And the Congress agreed to require that the new states grant Jews equality in citizenship, which was seen as a stunning victory in the campaign for emancipation. Here we go. Ludwig Philippson, 1811 to 1889, the founding editor of the flagship Jewish newspaper in Germany, the general newspaper of Jews or of Judaism, the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, which was considered to be the paper of record in the Jewish world. It existed from 1837 until the hyperinflation in 1922. Philippson wrote the following: with the declaration of the Berlin Congress, the period of aspiring for emancipation comes to a close. Never before had a principle achieved recognition after a century-long struggle in such a solemn and peaceful manner. So to sum up, we see three notable changes with the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Now there should be no, this is a Paris Peace Conference. Okay. First, the emancipationists replaced the court Jews of 1744 as the major political actors or intercessors. Second, the emancipationists at the Congress of Berlin were the only Jewish intercessors. Their claim to representation was uncontested. They constituted one party speaking with one voice. Third, the Berlin Congress was a paper victory. Romania ignored its obligations and refused to grant Jews citizenship with a vengeance. The great powers did not enforce the treaty. It's neither the first nor the last time that a diplomatic victory was a paper or Pyrrhic victory. Especially since, and it was a Pyrrhic victory because the great powers refused to enforce the treaties. It was a victory without teeth. Okay, my final example is the Paris Peace Conference of 1919-1920, after World War I. And here we see the politics of 20th century ideologies. The question is, how was it that Jews gained international guarantees of minority rights in the new successor states to Austria-Hungary and Tsarist Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia? The issue was President Wilson's 14 points, which aimed at self-determination for nations. In practice, this came to have two meanings. For the larger nations of East Central Europe, it meant having their own state. For the small minorities in East Central Europe's so-called nationalities belt of multiple minorities, it meant national minority rights in another's nation or polity. To elucidate further, there were two forms of national minority rights in circulation at the time. One was political national minority rights, which meant that the nationality was a recognized political group, that it could have its own elected parliament or representative body, including having powers of taxation, and that it would send delegates to the national parliament. The second form was cultural minority rights, which meant having one's own schools using the minority's language as the language of instruction, the ability to use one's own language in administration, particularly in the courts, for example, and state support or subsidies for the minorities' cultural institutions. The Paris Peace Conference revealed a fundamental change in Jewish politics from 1878. The emancipationists were no longer the sole party. They were now joined by and competed with the new Jewish politics of the 1890s. These included two forms of Jewish nationalism: Zionism, which contended that as a nation, Jews deserve their own territory or state, whether in Ottoman Palestine or elsewhere. The second form was that of autonomism, which saw Jews as a nation, especially in Eastern Europe, where they constituted a large minority, and claimed that Jews should have political and cultural minority rights. Now, one of the major figures or most prominent advocates of this kind of diaspora nationalism was the historian and political activist Shimon Dubnov, who lived from 1860 to 1942. Socialism, Jewish socialism, emerged at the same time in Eastern Europe and in the United States. Socialism emerged in the 1880s in the United States and in Eastern Europe, and Jewish socialists of the Bund also adopted the platform of minority rights. The first Bundescongress, as I mentioned, like the first Zionist Congress, was held in 1897. The other form of modern mobilized, organized Jewish politics that emerged at the time was organized Orthodox politics, which also emerged in this period. Rabbis and lay leaders in Central and Eastern Europe mobilized to found the Aguda in 1912 to promote Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox interests and to combat its secular rivals. The new political movements participated in the conference alongside the emancipationists. Zionists and autonomists wanted political and cultural minority rights. The emancipationists, based on their own experience, preferred individual rights, no collective rights. The two groups reached a compromise and requested national cultural rights, but not political rights. But there was also a strange circumstance at the peace conference. The great powers refused to admit the representatives of the national minorities in East Central Europe, for example, the Ukrainians and the Germans in Poland. In contrast, Jewish delegations were admitted, and they joined together to form an overall body. The strange circumstance then is that Jews came to speak on behalf of all of the minorities. They became the quintessential minority. The result of the Paris Peace Conference was that nations that aspired to be nation states ended up as nationality states. Poland is the primary example of this. Poland ended up with independent Poland, re-emerging on the map for the first time since the partitions of the 1770s and the 1790s, had a population, a third of which was constituted by minorities. You know, one of the great ironies of history, maybe it's not an irony, is that that search for national homogeneity was actually achieved after the Second World War. The murder of Jews, and the surviving Jews, by and most of them left, and the expulsion of the ethnic Germans. Those two combined led to the kind of ethnic homogeneity that these new states aspired to after the First World War, but ironically, or whatever, however you want to put it, only achieved after the Second World War. The successor states, including Poland, and this shows the kinds of articles that were written into the constitutions of the new states. The successor states were required to accept national minority cultural rights. Poland was the first state to agree to this and became a model for the other states. Like the Congress of Berlin, the Paris Peace Conference was a diplomatic victory, but a failure in practice. Minority rights failed because minorities with grievances were only allowed to approach the League of Nations through their own national governments, who had no interest in allowing those grievances to come to an international body. So there was no proper mechanism of representation. The League of Nations also had no power of enforcement. These were treaties without teeth. After the Second World War, there was a very strong sense that the minority rights treaties had failed, and therefore when the UN convened, well, actually just across the bay in San Francisco in 1944, it embraced the idea of human rights rather than minority rights. So in conclusion, let me say that I want to argue that modern Jewish politics did not start after 1881, but that emancipationism, as it emerged in the long 19th century, began modern Jewish politics. Modern Jewish politics turned on the issue of individual rights and citizenship. That the political movements which emerged after 1881, in fact, built on the foundations that the emancipationists had created. Lawyers and legal representation, newspapers, philanthropic and educational organizations, horizontal alliances with other social and political groups, and also what was characteristic of the emancipationists was a varied relationship to the state, in which Jews cooperated with the state, Jews were willing to come into conflict with the state and oppose state policies, and in which individual Jews were actually incorporated into the state and began to exercise the power of the state as individuals. In addition, I'd conclude that all of this shows a certain kind of resilience in politics, a resilience that's not about victories or lasting victories, because politics are forever fluid and changing, but rather the ability to adapt to new situations by creating new forms of politics in response to new circumstances and challenges, whatever the results. Thank you.
And hopefully David will take some questions. I'm going to pass the microphone to people. Why don't you just say your name and introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, David. Paula Fass. You gave us a fabulous introduction to a very different perspective on Jewish power. Mm-hmm. But until you get to the Paris conference, I kept asking myself, where are the ordinary Jews? I mean, you're really talking about wealthy people with influence and therefore power. But there are all these other Jews, most of them, not all, but most of them under the influence of a variety of rebbes, who are not being represented by the people you're describing until you get to the Paris conference, where there is this influence, this dual influence that comes together. So do you therefore still argue that this represents the interests of all the Jews, or does it really, up until the Paris conference, or does it really represent the influence of a very small minority of Jews?
Of Jews. Well, let me say something a little bit controversial and polemical. All Jews have never been represented. Okay? It's not, and it's also the case today, right? I mean, if you look at the American Jewish community, for example, American Jewry has been a fragmented community, or a fragmented group of people from the start. You've never had a legally recognized Jewish community or kahila. You've always had, in the early days, in the colonial period, in the early 19th century, you always had a pattern of multiple synagogues. If you didn't like the leadership in the one you were in, you went and founded your own, right?
Protestant society.
Yeah, so that's right, that's right. It's that pattern of voluntary religious organizations. You know, the new nationalist movements, the autonomists and the Zionists, how many Jews did they represent? You know, the Zionist movement was a movement by subscription. You know, you paid a shekel and you became a member. How many members were there at the first Zionist Congress? There were about 60,000 Jews who paid the shekel. By the
Represented a lot more.
the Aguda represented a lot more Jews, but once again, did it actually represent Amcha? Did it actually represent the common Jew? Because one of the characteristics of the Aguda is that the rabbis had absolute authority. And not only did the rabbis, I mean, and you could see this in the Aguda, in the sense that when the Rabbinic Council issued a halachic or legal decision, it was not required to offer proof texts. Their authority was absolutely unquestioned. So who did they represent? On the other hand, if you look at the 19th century, you know, there are a lot of Hasidic rebbes who actually intervened very successfully with the government of the Kingdom of Poland, for example, where they submit petitions in impeccable Polish, in which they cite Polish law and make very good cases for why they should be able to do what they want to do. So there was intercession, but I think, you know, I think the issue is that there has never been universal Jewish representation, not in any one country, certainly not internationally. You know, does the World Jewish Congress represent world Jewry? Come on. You know, there are always these claims to representation, grandiose claims, which are very impressive, but usually fairly hollow.
David, really terrific presentation, lots of things to think about. It seemed to me that you were giving it from the point of view of power, that is to say, the ability to intercede, the ability to have minority rights against the power of the state, the ability, in other words, to be active, but in an environment which is one that you do not define in terms of your own authority. So the potestas auctoritas distinction that goes all the way back to Rome is in a way elided. So it could be argued that the only time in which Jewish legitimate authority as a possibility is raised, that is to say, authority not only over themselves, but also over those who are not Jews within the territory that they have authority over, that only comes with the creation of Israel. That until then, the Jewish authority is always, in a sense, borrowed or non-existent, and it's power against another authority. So my real question is there a desire to, in a sense, establish authority as well as power outside of the Zionist movement? And if so, how does that happen? Or is it only with Zionism does that become an issue for Jewish politics?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Marty. You know, I think what I'm arguing, and this goes back to Paula's question as well, is first of all, the emancipationists represent the politics of notables. You know, there's no question that these are, by and large, people who attended elite schools, you know, an elite lycée in France, you know, Lycée Louis le Grand, or, you know, an excellent gymnasium in Germany or in England. You know, they went, you know, to to public school and then on to Oxford or Cambridge. The same in Russia as well. So this is clearly the politics of notables, which was characteristic of liberal politics and the politics of citizenship in the long 19th century. I guess what I would say to your question, Marty, is that, or what I would answer is that these are the politics of a minority group, which is trying to find a way to improve its own situation, to become part of the larger state, if not subsequently the larger society in different ways, and to function on the basis of equality. So it's an exercise of, you could call it the politics of grievance if you wanted. It's not far from that. But it is, I think it is a kind of notable, admirable politics that really is still with us today. It's that the emancipationist, or you could call it liberal politics, diaspora liberalism is still one of the major forms of Jewish politics in the contemporary world. And one of the reasons I think it's important to exhume and rehabilitate its history is that, especially in the United States, but also in the European diaspora, in other parts of the Jewish world, Australia, South Africa, Latin America, there's been a Zionization of Jewish politics, where Jewish politics have come to be identified with support for the State of Israel. And that other forms of Jewish politics are lesser, if not illegitimate. So I think what I'm trying to do is to recover that history, the history of that kind of politics, show that it's still with us today as a form of Jewish politics, and separate it from the byways and byways that it's gone along in the last 4 or 5 decades. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Thank you.
I've always felt I've never answered your question, Marty.
Thank you very much for your talk. I might betray my allegiances with this question, but I was curious why you don't think that you didn't suggest that the Board of Deputies of British Jews might have preceded the Board of Deputies of American Israelites as a civil defense organization, and why a moment like Moses Montefiore's as president of the BTPJ,
Yeah.
his intervention with the Damascus affair in 1840, why that might be separate from emancipatory intercession, and if the history of Jewish humanitarianism in the 19th century is a separate issue to the history of emancipationists.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Leo. An excellent question. First, I think it's important to keep in mind what kind of organization the Board of Deputies was in England. The Board of Deputies was modeled. I can't remember the exact organization, but it's modeled on the board of the dissenting Protestant sects in England. So it is first and foremost a religious organization. It is a consortium of all the synagogues in England, right? So that makes it a religious organization. What you're talking about with Montefiore, the Damascus affair and many other things, Montefiore used that religious organization to intercede with foreign governments. And he did that very successfully for a number of reasons. First of all, he was extraordinarily wealthy in his own right. He had alliances with the dissenting churches in England. When he would call a meeting at, what's the name of the mayor's official residence in London? Sorry? Okay. All of his Quaker friends would appear. And he had business relations with Quakers. He was very closely tied to the abolitionist movement. In fact, it was Montefiore who floated the loan of $20 million to repay slaveholders for the property they had lost. So he made it possible for the abolitionist movement to succeed. And if I remember correctly, that loan was only retired about 5 years ago. The other thing is Montefiore had access to well, for most of the time it was Her Majesty's government. When he left to go to Egypt in response to the Damascus affair, he went with the blessing of Her Majesty's government, as opposed to Adolphe Crémieux, for example, who went in opposition to his own government, to the French government, because the French government was supporting the first consul in Damascus, who actually was responsible for creating the Damascus affair. So the British Board of Deputies was not a civil defense organization, it was a religious organization. There is a civil defense organization concerned with foreign Jewish communities, which emerges in 1870 out of a chapter of the Alliance in England. I forget. The Anglo-Jewish Association, that's right. So that is the civil defense organization, but not concerned with domestic affairs, only with foreign ones. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Was there? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Thank you. That was fascinating. I learnt a lot. I have a question about your final concluding statement, because I'm thinking, can we really describe this as what you've described, the different approaches that they use to make their case, as new forms of politics that are being created? Or rather, is it a case of trying to make the case as best you can in the ways that were available in each of these three contexts at the time? And so a subtle thing which rests on what you mean by the word politics in this case. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. My answer would be yes and yes. That they are new forms of politics because Jews for the first time are taking advantage of new means of politics emerging in the course of the 19th century, right? The 19th century is the great age of the press, right? In which the press is seen as the fourth estate, right? As having an absolutely essential role in political life, representation, defending individual rights, defending the truth, etc. Well, if you look around, the first Jewish newspaper, the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, the general Jewish newspaper, founded in 1837, was based on Protestant newspapers in Germany, which were flourishing at the time, right? So this is a means of politics which is available in larger society, and Jews are then availing themselves of it. Same thing with lawyers, right? Of treating the state, trying to hold the state to its pretensions of being a state of law, a Rechtsstaat. And that's even the case in Russia. You know, there isn't an independent judiciary in Russia until 1864. It's part of Alexander II's great reforms. The judiciary until that point was part of the executive. And once you have an independent judiciary in 1864, one of the interesting things that happens is there was still great censorship of the press, but the press could report on what was said in courts. So what lawyers did was to take cases to court and get people to make the political statements and talk about the issues that couldn't otherwise be reported in the press. Okay, so it's just making use of available means of politics. What I would argue in terms of available means of politics, the emancipationists, I pointed to lawyers, newspapers, educational and philanthropic organizations. It's actually emancipationists in Russia who create the first Jewish political parties in Galicia and then in Russia. In Russia, after 1905, you have a political party that emerges when other political parties are emerging in Russia for the first time. It's the first time you have a Duma, a representative body in Russia. And then the new political movements, like the Zionists, the autonomists, the Aguda, begin to add to those things. The Bund in particular adds the idea of trade unions. That's introduced first by the Bund, and then the Zionists pick that up. You have the labor Zionism creating a major trade union, the Histadrut, which is absolutely central to the creation of Jewish settlement in Ottoman and Mandate Palestine, and absolutely essential for the success of the labor Zionist movement. Because what Ben-Gurion did was to create a political machine where political operatives in the Labor Party had positions in the Histadrut for which they were paid. So you were using the labor movement's funds in order to pay political operatives, and that was an innovation at the time. What was Ben-Gurion's model for this? The Bolshevik Party. He's doing this in the early 1920s, and he's following the Bolsheviks. Another new feature of the nationalist and socialist movements among Jews is the political type of the professional or full-time revolutionary. You don't find that among the emancipationists. They're part-time politicians, right? They're businessmen, they're lawyers, editors, journalists, but they're not full-time political revolutionaries. You find that among the Bundists, you find that among the Zionists. David Ben-Gurion was a full-time politician, a revolutionary. Now, he claimed to have roots in the kibbutz movement. He worked in the fields for maybe 18 months. And after that, he was full-time as a political leader.
So I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask you a question that's kind of an unfair one.
Okay, I love unfair
but I think that some version of it is probably on a lot of people's minds. So the examples you gave us, it's a great talk, learned so much. They're all examples, obviously, from, as you said, contexts where Jews are seeking rights with not great sort of means in certain ways, and relatively powerless. It goes back to Marty's question in a way. The question is sort of, if you look at today's context of Jewish politics, and let's say particularly in the United States, where many people in the Jewish community, many Jewish organizations feel Jews are newly embattled in ways that they haven't been in living memory in the United States, while simultaneously these politics are inextricably tied up with a sovereign Jewish state. How do you see, do you see this as a new version of a certain kind of emancipationist politics? Do you see it as categorically different? How would you sort of compare it to the historical moments that you looked at?
Yeah, that's a tough and controversial question. One thing I would argue, and I got a lot of criticism for this, is that in my book on emancipation, I include a chapter on the state of Israel and argue that the state of Israel is still undergoing a process of emancipation because you have unequal citizenship, right? Mizrahi Jews, in many cases, are not full equal citizens. Situation is changing, improving, but that's the Palestinians or Arabs in Israel, even those within the Green Line, are not full and equal citizens. There's still discrimination. Not to talk about beyond the Green Line. Women in Israel still suffer as second-class citizens in terms of personal status law, because personal status law is still under the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts. Marriage, divorce, burial, etc. Right? That's why lots of Israelis who want to have a civil marriage fly to Cyprus, because there's no civil marriage in Israel. One of my esteemed colleagues in reviewing my book said, emancipation only applies as a process and a concept to Jews living in non-Jewish societies. Who says? Right? So I think that's one issue. Clearly, I think, Ethan, you're pointing to a very new situation in which Jews in the diaspora have to sort out their politics from the politics of the State of Israel. And it's become increasingly difficult. But this goes back to Paula's question, actually, about, how many Jews are actually represented. I mean, I think what's happened in the United States today is that there's a growing gap between the Jewish population at large and the organized organized Jewry, the major Jewish organizations. Why is that the case? It's actually a development characteristic of the larger society. It's that big money has taken over those organizations. It's circles of large donors who actually dictate the policies of those organizations. It has to do with a change in the fundraising model of Jewish communities. In the 20th century, when the Jewish Federation movement emerged and tried to unify fundraising in each city or region, the model was that of immediate distribution. You would have an annual campaign of fundraising, and then the funds would be immediately distributed to those in need in the community. That began to change significantly in the 1960s and 70s, but particularly in the Reagan and post-Reagan era, because the tax laws were changed in such a way that you could have family foundations which were administered by the Jewish communities, and that those became the major source of funding for Jewish organizations. And so from the 1980s to the 1990s, it's the proprietors of those family foundations which have actually become the political power in the organized Jewish community. So there's a growing gap or distance between the views of the majority of Jews, of Amcha, and these organizations. You can see it in an organization like AIPAC, for example, which was founded in the 1950s, very small, obscure organization, became more important in the 1970s and 1980s under a director who was dovish, who was in favor of a two-state solution. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a small group of big donors kicked him out and changed the direction of the organization. And so that's the AIPAC we have today. It's the same with the Anti-Defamation League. So does that, I don't know where that's
all very interesting. And
I don't know where that's taken us.
A lot of the way toward an answer, I think. I don't see any further hands. We've kept you a long time, David. This is immensely rich and fascinating. Thank you so much. Let's thank David one more time.